Namaste, Sonia. How are you doing? So nice to see you.
Wonderful to see you too on this auspicious day.
Yes, it's a very auspicious day indeed. So, dear friends, we are here with our very dear Sonia Nelson from New Mexico, America, and we are going to have this conversation today to celebrate the birthday of our teacher, Sri T.K. Desikachar. And we are very, very happy to have Sonia talk today. Actually, to be very, to have full disclosure, Sonia, I've been asking you for this conversation since last year, December, and it's just taken about 6 months to manifest. However, the plan is perfect. It's just not our plan. So the plan is so perfect that it falls today on my father's birthday, and it was destiny that you had to talk on this day and not another day before. So it's really, really wonderful. So
And I'm very honored really to be doing it on this day.
that's fantastic. That's very, very, I'm so happy to hear that. And so, Sonia, before I introduce you to everybody, I think it's very auspicious if you will begin this with your chanting, which is such a gift for all of us. So please um, let us hear you chant.
Om Punarma Atma Punarayuragat Puna Prana Punarakutamagat Vaishvanaro Rashmibhirvavridhanaha Antastishtat Tvamrutasya Gopaha.
Wow, that's so beautiful. Sonia, thank you so much for sharing. And dear friends, welcome to our talk called Viniyoga Women. And we have Sonia today. Sonia is probably after my mother, the most senior teacher now in our tradition. And just before we began the interview today, we were just talking, and I asked her when she actually met my father the first time. And your answer was, Sonia?
1975 January.
Yes. And that was the time when I was not even born. I was still in my mother's womb. I was born in July 1975. So you met my father 7 months before I met him. So Sonia is a very, very long-term student of this tradition and of very close student to my father. And there's been such a long history, Sonia, that you have shared with my father and other teachers and students in this tradition. We are so lucky to have you. Sonia is a wonderful chanting teacher, and she used to run the Vedic Chant Center, and I will ask her to speak about that as well. And she is really, really an extraordinary woman, and she's been somebody who is very, very close to our tradition and more importantly to our family. And it's really wonderful that we know each other for so long, Sonia. So thank you so much for coming today to share your experiences with all of us who are listening in today. So, Sonia, the first question I want to ask is always I ask everybody is the origins. How did you come to meet my father, and how things evolved from there? Can you please give us a general history of what happened?
Yes, it actually begins with Narayana. My husband Neil and I were living in Albuquerque, and we met a man whose name was Narayana Murthy. He was a philosophy student from UC Berkeley who was teaching in Albuquerque. during the summer. And we met him because he was holding discussions at his apartment, and discussions on, I would say, life issues. During one of these discussions, he played a recording of J. Krishnamurti. This was my first introduction to Krishnamurti. This recording made a very big impression on me and my husband, Neil. Eventually, we went to see Krishnamurti in person in Los Angeles. We discovered that your father was his yoga teacher. We had had no exposure to yoga at this time. At the same time, we moved to Berkeley, and through Narayana Murthy, we met a friend of his who was a student or had been a student of your father's in Madras, and who was a practitioner of yoga. We went to visit this person, and he was in the middle of doing his practice when we arrived. He said, "You can go for a walk we lived in the woods in Northern California." He said, "Go for a walk, or you can watch me do my practice." We had never seen anyone do yoga before. He was very adept at asana, and he was doing Padmasana and all the movements in Padmasana. He had a very strong Ujjayi breath, which at the time I thought was because he might have a deviated septum, not knowing anything about Ujjayi. But we watched him for about 15 minutes, and we were so taken with the beauty, the dignity of the movement, that at that time, my husband especially wanted to pursue learning this yoga. So eventually, this friend of Murthy's taught Narayana Murthy what he had learned. Okay, not what was adapted for Murthy, but what he had learned. Then Narayana Murthy taught my husband and me what this young man was doing. Fortunately for my husband, the practice was quite appropriate. For me, it was definitely the wrong practice, although for some time I did it. So as things evolved, my husband was really taken with the practice of yoga and wanted to find a teacher. As I said, we were at the time living in Berkeley. This is a very interesting story. He was walking down the street in San Francisco, and on a telephone pole, he saw a notice, a flyer. It said, "Just returned from Madras, India, from long-time study with T.K.V. Desikachar. Contact Douglas Rowstone."
Douglas.
Douglas. So my husband contacted Douglas and began a long-term, very regular study and practice with Douglas. You'll notice I'm not saying anything about myself because I was not at this time practicing. So Douglas was so taken with Neil's dedication that he suggested that he study with Desikachar, study with Sir. So Douglas wrote to Sir and asked if Neil could come and study. Eventually, it was approved. Your father accepted Neil as a student, and we made plans to go to Madras. At that time, one could only be with each other for a minimum of 6 months. He wouldn't accept Western students anyway, unless they came for 6 months. So it turned out that it took us that long to get our visas. And, in those days, things were much more complicated. And finally, 6 months probably after his acceptance, we arrived for another 6 months to stay in Madras. When we got there, we came to your house, which is another side story. I won't go into that. We came to your house, and your father graciously showed us into his teaching room and spoke with Neil. And then he asked me what I was going to be doing while I was there. This is 6 months in a foreign country. I had no plans. So fortunately for me, he said, "You came to my door, I will teach you." So this was a grace. It was a gift, a gift. And the other half of this gift was that my dear husband gave up one of his classes every week so that I could study with your father. These classes were very precious. At that time in 1975, there were quite a few Western students in Madras studying with your father at one time. So the classes were given, maybe you had 3 classes a week, something like that. Anyway, so I must really be grateful, first of all, to my husband for being so generous to give up one of those classes every week so that I could study with your father. So this is how we met TKV Desikachar and began our studies.
Just let me interject here, Sonia, because I'm very curious about this as well. What were your first, yours and Neil's first impressions about my father? Very few people who knew him at that time are still around. So it's very interesting to ask you, because my father would have been a very young man as well in this time. He must have been in his late 30s or early 40s, late 30s probably.
Yeah, because I was 31, I think he was 36.
37, 36, yeah.
Yeah. So he was himself. That was our impression. He didn't have any airs, if you have that expression. Okay, there were no expectations that we would accept in a very friendly, genuine manner, which over the years never changed, actually. Whoever he was, that's who he presented.
That's great. That's great. So in the beginning that you were learning these classes, what were these classes made of? Was it asana, or was it pranayama, or was it something else?
It was mostly asana and then some pranayama. I think it's very interesting how he taught me, because I was not a physically active, leave out the very, I was not a physically active person. And so I was quite a challenge for him. I was quite overweight, and I was not used to doing any kind of physical exercise. So that was my starting point. He had something in mind. And by the end of the 6 months, little by little, going step by step, I ended up being able to do Padmasana. It took almost the whole 6 months, and all of the small steps that he did, he never really mentioned what the purpose was. He just said, okay, now do this. And, Dvipadapitam, Shakavakasana, very, very simple things. And then Ardhabada, Padmasana, Uttanasana with the leg in Padmasana. So it was an experience that I always felt I could do what he was asking me to do. Okay, and I never felt that there were expectations that I needed to do more. The only thing was that I would practice, which I did regularly. And then toward the end of the 6 months, one day he said, okay, now let's see if you can do Padmasana. And I did it. There was no struggle. There was no fear involved. It just happened because the preparation was so appropriate for me.
That's fantastic. It's very interesting, Sonia, that you talk about a lot about the asanas in the beginning. So how did that evolve into chanting? Because you are probably one of the few students who have learned so much of chanting from my father. So how did that evolve from asanas to Vedic chanting eventually?
Yeah. So we have to skip ahead to 1977. So after our 6 months, your father told us to go back home and teach. And in the meantime, I really continued my interest in J. Krishnamurti and found out that he was going to be starting a school in Ojai, California. My interest was to teach. I had taught children before. This was to be a school for very young children up through what we call high school. My husband, on the other hand, was becoming more and more interested in pursuing his yoga studies. And so in 1977, he went back to India, to Madras, for a year to study with your father. And I moved to Ojai, California, to be at the what's called the Oak Grove School, to teach to children, teach yoga, teach art, teach music. I've done all of those things. And so we had this distance separation. We weren't separated, but we were doing our own things, okay? So Neil went for a year, and after the school year ended from September to June, I went back for 3 months to Madras to study more with your father. This is how I became interested in chanting. I met Neil. We were going to travel for a bit before returning to Madras to study. We were in Delhi, and we were in the hotel. I can picture this so clearly. Neil had a tape recorder and a tape. And on this tape was your father chanting the Yoga Sutra, along with some invocations. And he was chanting it very slowly. I had never heard anything like this before. Music and chanting and Hebrew chanting had been a part of my childhood, for most of my childhood. So hearing this chanting somehow, which was so different, took me back to my own experiences as a child. So I had this immediate connection to what was on that tape. This tape made husband to help him learn to chant Yoga Sutra. I knew at that point I was going to pursue chanting, even though your father was not offering this at the time. I said to myself, even if I have to wait till I'm an old woman, I will pursue this. This is how it started. Eventually, your father, probably because of interest from other Western students, and I must mention people like David Schoenfeld, who was a musician and who was studying with your father, people were asking for chanting. And so slowly, he began to agree to teach.
You mean the photographer, David?
No, David Schoenfeld.
Schoenfeld. Okay, okay. Not Scheinbaum.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. That's interesting. That's
And
interesting.
David Schoenfeld, actually, we met and became good friends. And he visited us. He is actually the one who taught me my first Vedic chantings. He taught me everything he had learned from your father, which was probably maybe not more than 10 to 15 very short chants. I still have the papers that he wrote out for me.
Oh, that'll be interesting to see. Yeah, wonderful. Wonderful. So, was it just this audio tape that Neil had that drew you to chanting, or once you started, how did it evolve? Like, was there something else that happened that sustained you? Because you didn't stop with just learning those 10 few things. So you've learned so many Vedic chants, Sonia, that many Indian people also don't know so much chanting.
Yes. I think as your father felt more comfortable teaching Vedic chanting to Western students, then when I would learn from him, when I would study with him, uh, chanting would be a big part of what I wanted. You know, he was always, um, he would go with the interest of the student. Although at some point, I think he felt I might be a little crazy for chanting and that I should be also studying other things, doing also studying text, whatever. But I somehow felt that this was my main interest. This is what grabbed me.
And was it this time where there was this conference that was organized with my grandfather about meditation, and was it this time after that, or was it before that?
Oh, it was organized with your grandfather. There was a meditation seminar.
Correct.
Yes, I came
Correct.
to that. And
And I know you were there.
actually, I was there with Miriam, my daughter. So in the meantime, I had had a child, my daughter Miriam, and she was 8 years old. And she came with me for, we were there for at least a month. This workshop on meditation was 2 weeks. And I remember that your father asked me to chant something, and what I chose to chant was Bhadrang Karane Bhishmanayama Devaha. Yeah, so he asked me to do that to open the workshop. So I had obviously been learning different chants up until that point. But then I have to tell you this. This is interesting because this story will take you from my focus on chanting to something else that has become very important to me, which is meditation. After the 2-week workshop, then I had private study with your father. You can imagine that being in Madras as a single person with an 8-year-old daughter was a little bit challenging. So I was quite distracted. And one day, I don't know if your mother remembers this, but she came to me and she said, "Sir wants to see you." So I didn't know what was up, but of course I went to see him and he informed me about my level of distraction and said, but this is very important. He said, "If you want, I can help you." So this for me was a turning point because this interaction evolved into him devising a personal meditation practice for me that was meant to help bring focus to me, even having an 8-year-old challenge. And the way he devised it, knowing that I had an art background, he had me paint a yantra. He had me go on with this, Kausthub. This is, I think, very interesting. He gave me a book that had many, many yantras in it, all just the black and white diagrams, the drawings. And he said, choose something from this, but choose something that's not, he went like this, not circular. Choose something that has some structure, right?
Yeah.
So I took the book home, back to the apartment, and looked through it, chose several, and came back and said, these are the ones that I like the most. He said, okay, pick one. So I chose one. And then he took me shopping to a store that had art supplies. So we got papers and paints, and he said, now you make a picture, you draw it, you paint it, and then we'll devise a practice around it. So he didn't give me something that was already complete. He engaged me in the evolution, the development of this picture.
Kind of like an empowerment of yourself.
Yes, yes, incredible. So, but when I was in art school, ceramics was my major. Drawing actually was quite difficult for me, especially something highly structured with real measurements. So after about 5 days, he said, well, where is the picture? And he said, you'll appreciate this, Kausthub. He said, my son could have done this in 5 minutes.
I'm not so sure, but I'm not a great artist, but yes, I can imagine him saying that.
Yes. Anyway, I finally finished it, and I chose the colors that were important to me. And the yantra had the Star of David in it, which was related to my Jewish heritage. And I brought it to him, and he looked at it, and he said, good. He said, as you use it, you will see all the defects, meaning this was supposed to be exact measurement.
Yeah.
This exact measurement was kind of the opposite of my nature, let's say, my personality. But that picture is still with me. It's just to my left here.
Oh,
I still use it.
can we
And at
see it?
some point, do you want to see it?
Wow,
Blur?
interesting to see it.
Okay, so, well, this is interesting. Let me show you this. I don't mind. Tell me, I have to move Narayana.
A little bit down. Oh, wow, I can see behind that. Oh, it's the Muladhara structure with the Star of David. Oh, beautiful.
Here. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic.
Okay.
You have basically put the Anahata chakra inside the Muladhara. Beautiful.
So to get everything done.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah. The funny thing was, on the way home from Madras, Miriam and I stopped in Hawaii. The painting was in my suitcase. My suitcase got lost. I was so upset. So we had to come back to California, no suitcase, no painting. About 5 days later, at 5 in the morning, the doorbell rings. It's the airline, someone from the airlines with my suitcase. The painting was inside. Turns out the suitcase had gone all over the world. And they finally traced where it belonged and brought it to me. And this meant to be picture was there.
And this was the days before everything was computerized, right, in the airlines. So it must have been much, I mean, much more difficult to trace and track. But I'm so glad that they did it. I'm so glad that they did it. Sonia, why we are, no?
I just wanted to say he developed a practice for me to do in relationship to this picture, which the practice has evolved over years and changed over the years. But this was the beginning of interest in meditation for me.
It's very, very fascinating. And I want to ask you something about that. But before that, since you talk about your daughter, we have to acknowledge that she was my first teacher of American slang. So Archie's comics, you remember, huh? She is my guru.
Yes, and I must say now, because yes, in those days, comics were a good source of keeping her focused while in Madras, but she ended up being a librarian.
That's great.
And so she evolved beyond Archie's comics.
Yes, thankfully.
Yes.
So Sonia, I want to ask you a very interesting question, because you said that the introduction to meditation, that story is very, very significant, because you said that my father called you aside and talked to you about how distracted you were and was offering to help you with the meditation. So I wonder what it is that is the quality of a student in such kind of context, because in today's times, when as teachers uh, we try to point out some of these kind of challenges that the students have, that even to say something like that they are distracted, they get so agitated and say, what the hell do you know? You know. And so I'm wondering, what is in your view um, the quality of a good student in when these kind of subjects are brought up? What is it that made you listen to sir at this time? So you could connect the two.
Well, I must say, it was difficult to hear that, you know, when you are juggling being a mother and juggling being a student. Okay. And so Sarah was not saying choose. He wasn't saying don't be focused on your child. Only pay attention to your studies and to me. He was saying, I can help you. Without those words, I think I would have been in conflict. So I think there's this principle that he really worked from, which is that unless he had something to offer to help a situation, he would stay out of the situation. He could have let me just go on being distracted and being a poor student. But he must have seen some potential in me to make this offer, because at the time he was not teaching meditation to students.
Yes.
And he said, please don't tell anyone we're doing this. He said, this is between us. He said, I'm not, other people have asked, but I'm not at this time teaching meditation. So I think it was the offer of help for the situation that made it possible for me to move forward with this awareness. Oh, I'm distracted. I'm not being a good student. Move forward in a way that was natural, that had that was about me and not about you should be focused. It wasn't like that. it was, there's help. I can give you that help. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that does answer my question. That does answer my question. But it also raises another question because, and you know this, you have had such long term studies with the same teacher for so long. Whereas in today's times, people are distracted from one teacher to another, one tradition to another, one system to another as well. People want to not just do yoga, but they also want to do some other thing and some other thing. So, is it that today's problem is because there are a lot of choices, or is today's problem because the minds of people are distracted? I would ask you this because of your own experience of staying with one tradition, one teacher for so long, compared to what most people are doing today. What's the scenario like? What is it that is the situation? Is it because of too much choice, or is it because of lack of focus and commitment, or a combination of both?
I think it's a combination of both, but I think the choices that are offered reach people at the level of the mind that can be distracted. So when it's not, there's something that isn't satisfied. Therefore, oh well, let me try over here. And then it enters into the mind again, and people try different things, but they don't end up being satisfied at a deeper level. So I think for me, from the beginning, there was always a strong connection that was beyond um, a mental one, beyond an intellectual one. And I think that this is the part of the problem. There are so many choices, and people, which encourages distraction. But I think people often think that I don't know what they think because frankly, I've always been with one tradition. So I can't speak for people who jump around, but I see, and I see in students that um, people become dissatisfied, and instead of staying with something, they want else. So there is this lack of ability to sustain connection when things become difficult or when things are not satisfied at a superficial level. Does that make
That's
sense?
that's so interesting that you say that, and that raises me to ask you a question. You know, you had this almost 40 years of connection with my father as a teacher student. And I wonder, in all of this time, whether it was always smooth, or were there some moments where there were also some challenges? And if so, how did you overcome? And when I say you, I mean you both.
Yeah, there were some challenges. Um, wow, which one to pick?
Choose one.
I think, well, okay, so here's another thing that I have thought of. You know, as we said in the beginning, I was 31, your father was about 36, 37. So we were both maturing over all of this time period. At a certain point, one of the most difficult experiences was when I was going through menopause. We'll jump to from 31 to 50. Um, and it was, you know, a very emotional time for me. And I think that what might have been difficult for your father in dealing with someone going through menopause, it may have been a cultural thing, it may have been a gender thing, right? I don't know, but there was uh, conflict in the sense of disappointment. You know, my mind, even though it had gotten much more focused from that time period of 1988, now my mind was in this menopausal state. And I don't know if you as a man can understand what that mind is like. It's a little bit soft and mushy, or it can be. And so at that time when I was having classes, not just the private classes, but with two other of his students, and he was challenging all three of us. And he gave each of us a word. And he said, my word was, be sharp. Sharp. Well, that was the opposite of, you know, this state that I was, it's a hormonal state that I was in. And so it seemed impossible to me. So this was very, very challenging, because I think as he was evolving, his expectations influenced how he was relating to his students. This is human nature. And I think after a certain point, his expectations, they didn't become lower, they became more appropriate to the person that he was relating to. But yeah, so things were difficult at that point, but I want to continue this because I went home, and a year later I came back. I used to go every year after a certain point. And I told your father, because this stayed with me, this experience, this difficulty stayed with me. And I explained to him how difficult it had been. And it was so interesting because he didn't, I think it surprised him. And he said, again, he was offering something. He didn't offer psychology. He didn't offer, oh, let's analyze the situation. What was it that I said? What did you go through? Blah, blah, blah. None of that. He said, we'll do something if you're open to it. There was always that. If you're open to it, we will do a ritual. And this will take care of everything. And so we did it. I was open. Every morning for a week, we did a particular ritual before we started our class, with chanting, with offering. And then the offering was burned at the end. In heat. There's always some humorous side to this. So there were these leaves from a particular tree. So he wanted a vessel to put them in to burn them. We burned them in a metal vessel, and then he wanted me to have them. These were the burnt offerings. He went to your mother's closet and he took a wooden box and he put them, all the burnt, oily leaves, ashes in there, and closed it, gave it to me. This is the end. And it totally cleaned everything. Everything was burnt up.
That's an excellent story.
No psychology.
Yeah, sometimes we don't need psychologies. That's very, very great story. That's very good. And I just want to slightly deviate, and then we come back to my father, because I really think that this is very important as well, because you're one of those very few people who still are around who met my grandfather, right? So what kind of impressions or memories you have about meeting him, and how was it? What can you share with us?
I think that, well, the first time we came to your house in 1975, we came up in in a rickshaw, and your grandfather was sitting there on the porch reading a newspaper. And he just, my husband asked for Desikachar, and your grandfather nodded or pointed or something. Nope, nothing, no communication. And then the next time, that year when I was there with Miriam, so your grandfather, he was there. He was just always there, but there wasn't any interaction. The next time when, in 1988, there was an interview with your grandfather. And Miriam was there, and that's, we have that photo of, do you want to see that photo?
Please.
Since you're asking about can you see?
Yes, beautiful photo.
Yeah. So your father interviewed your grandfather for a small group of students. And the very interesting thing about that was the conversation, or the back and forth between your father and your grandfather, was of a more intellectual nature. And so it went, to me, it wasn't very stimulating. And then your father asked him a question about someone who was having trouble with his knee or his leg or his ankle or something. Immediately, your grandfather switched out of this intellectual mode and started being a yoga therapist and talking about, how did this happen? How often did he have the pain? How strong was the pain? What was he doing for it? All of these things. And that's somehow impressed me, that he could go from this very kind of high level of intellectual exploration to dropping that immediately. And this person was in front of him and dealing with what actually was there and going on at the time.
I can imagine so much, because now we are translating my grandfather's Yoga Sutra commentary, and some of the sections are so intellectually so high, it's so difficult to translate. But yet I know he can just suddenly come down to the earth and connect with the student in front of him. There is some difficulty, especially.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Sonia, slowly going back to my father, I would just want to ask you, I've spent so much time with my father, not just in a classroom teaching situation, but also in other informal, non-classroom situations as well. Spend so much time there. Well, what kind of things that you've learned from those kind of circumstances and situations that are not just classroom situations like, chanting or asana, padmasana, things like that, but something else that you learned from these non-classroom settings? I mean, you spend so much time with my father.
Yeah. Yeah, because we traveled a lot in the States when he was doing workshops. We traveled together when I was hosting the workshops, especially at when they were Colgate University, and was helping to organize. So yeah, there were a lot of informal.
But also in India, you traveled a lot.
Yes, that's true.
You went to Varanasi, you went to
we went to Badrinath.
Badrinath.
Yeah, and we went to Mysore.
Yeah.
To the Parakala Mutt.
Yeah.
Was there. We went to Pune for Mr. Iyengar's 80th birthday.
Yeah.
That was very yeah. So yeah, he was, like I said before, he was always himself. And he was very gracious and interested in everything. I think that one of the qualities that I really saw in him, because of this out of the classroom time, was that he was always learning. He, one example of this actually was not in India, but here in New Mexico at Santuario, in Chimayo, you've been there. Yeah, so the first time we went there, I think he was so taken to find a place in the United States that exuded some kind of a spiritual atmosphere. And we went to so many different parts of this Santuario. It's an old Indian, Native American site, land. It was originally Native American. And then there's now a church, very old, beautiful Catholic church that people make pilgrimages to, and people walk hundreds of miles to come to this church. So there is something that's been established there in the earth, in the building itself, and by the people's devotion. It's a very devotional place. And when we were there, he wanted to know, it was like he was absorbing this. So not knowledge at an intellectual level, but the feeling. And from then on, he would recommend to people that they go visit this place. So this learning includes being open to new experience.
Yeah. He told me many times to go to Chimayo, and we went together with you in Muladhara.
Yeah.
He was always saying that. Sonia, this is also something that I think will be very interesting for people that probably only you can share. And since it's his birthday today, I think it's a very auspicious day to talk about this very, very sweet story. What's the story between my father and you bringing him baklava every time you come?
Oh.
You remember that Greek restaurant in Santa Fe?
Yeah. I thought about that in a long time. Yeah, so on several visits, we would go to this, we needed to find vegetarian food, which it's not always easy in the States at that time. And so there was a Middle Eastern Greek restaurant called Yanni's, and we would go there, and they had baklava. And forget the food, he loved the baklava. It's so sweet, with all the honey and the walnuts and and totally vegan. And so he loved that. And so the next times that I came, I would go to Yanni's before my trip and have a big box of baklava prepared.
I mean, we saw him just consume most of it by himself.
Yeah. Sugar was favorite.
Yeah, my father really loved very sweet food, very sweet food, very sweet food. Sonia, there's one last question for me, from me. Considering that today is, let's say, my father's birthday, it is, what is it that you would like to tell him? Or if you met him today, what would you tell him?
Oh. I would somehow express my gratitude and my thanks, and I would let him know that everything that he transmitted to me informally filled my life and totally transformed me into who I am. but who I always was, but allowed that to flower. And I think that's what he would be happy to hear, that, um, one's, your actions are not in vain, right? The effort that you put in to someone, because effort was always there.
Yeah.
There has to be that effort. And yeah, that's what I would tell him. That did.
Is my memory correct, Sonia? Because I remember one time you telling me that it was, please correct me if I'm wrong, that it was through this chanting that you learned with my father that you reconnected back to your Jewish chanting tradition. Is it correct that my memory is correct?
Yeah. You see, I had an interesting upbringing because my parents were not religious, but we had a strong cultural Jewish background. And so I learned a lot. I went to what's called folk shul for 5 years as a child, after school every day. And so I learned Hebrew, which I've almost totally forgotten. I learned Jewish history, all of that. And then, like many other people in my generation, pushed it away. And, but your father saw that it was still there in me. And in fact, he would say, you sound one way when you do Vedic chanting, and then you sound a totally different way when you do chanting in Hebrew.
Yeah.
So he could see that, even though it had gotten buried with the whole counterculture experience of my life, as I matured. But yeah, so anyway, it's not that I'm back to being Jewish and an observant Jewish person, because I was never that, but I am connected to that which is in me through chanting, through using my voice.
That's so fantastic. Sonia, one question one of the participants is asking, Maria Alejandra from Colombia, she's asking, allow me to ask a question of perception to Sonia about the concept of the relationship between T. Krishnamacharya and T. K.V. Desikachar. How did you see the relationship between the two, T. K.V. Desikachar and his father, T. Krishnamacharya?
Yeah.
Beautiful question.
I'll give an example. So in the room where your father was teaching, so against the wall would be his desk, and it's hard to do this. He would be facing me, but on the wall up in front of him would be the picture of your father. And what he told me, and this has really informed my relationship with my students, is that it's the teaching, and the teacher is behind you, and you're the vehicle for the teaching to come for the student. And so I noticed that anytime that he was pondering something that I might have asked him, or something to do with what we were studying, sometimes he'd be looking down, and other times he'd be looking at his father. So I think his father was his source.
Yeah.
That's the word that I would use. That was their relationship.
That's extraordinary. Very, very, very beautiful. Thank you. I hope Maria Alejandra is happy with the answer. So, Sonia, we are slowly coming to the end of our time now. And I think you have a small treat for us to conclude, right?
Yes, if I can chant this, something your father wrote.
Please.
He wrote this for my group that was coming. I brought several groups different times to Madras, Chennai. And this was in 1990 something. So your father and I communicated through writing poems quite a bit. And he always felt that the poems needed to be put to chanting. So he would always encourage me to chant what he had written. So I put this particular poem to an old English, what we call a round. I don't know if you know what a round is, but that's too complicated. So I put it to this tune. So I'm going to try singing it for you, okay? Transformation is the heart prevailing over the head. The source is the heart, the means is its dominance. The method is 123. Yoga Sutra. The need is bandhana. The hope is the crescent. Transformation is the heart prevailing over the head.
So nice, so nice. Thank you so much, Sonia. Thank you for being part of this interview on this very special day. It's really touching. It's the best thing we can do for Sir.
Yes. And again, I want to thank him and thank you for inviting me to be here on this day. And I hope I've shared something genuine.
Oh, it was so beautiful and genuine. And I didn't invite you. I literally had to push you for 6 months. But I'm so glad you accepted my invitation. Thank you so much.
I'm slow.
That's okay. That's good. As I said, it's all in the right time. The plan is perfect. And thank you all for listening to us today and watching this interview. Please feel free to share it on your social medias or with your students. This is such a precious interview we have today. And we will have one more in about 2 weeks' time, my dear friends. Thank you for being here. Namaste. Namaste, Sonia. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kausthub.
Thank you.